How do you create a great villain? In this video, I'm going to give you a few tips that will help you to create a killer villain. Literally, a killer villain that kills people. Maybe, I don't know, it depends what your story is about, doesn't it? But anyway, Cowboy Josh, I just wanted to ask Cowboy Josh, what do you think makes a good villain? How do you write a villain? This could be very interesting. Anyway, these are the 5 tips that will help you to create an amazing villain. The first one is to give the villain more power, or at least equal, probably more power than the protagonist, because then obviously it creates more conflict. Conflict is perhaps the most important thing in a story. A lot of stories give the villain power in a very visible way, for example physical power or magical power, but I believe it's very clever if you give your villain power in a different, less visible way. For example, Voldemort has very high manipulative power, and he's able to manipulate people into doing things that he wants them to do because he appears nice and kind and hospitable to other people, but inside he actually has very evil motives. If you create a villain that has any kind of power that is not physical, then it adds another layer of danger and another layer of unpredictability. For example, you could create a villain that actually has very low resources, so they perhaps don't have that much power, but because their mind is tactical, and because they attack at the heart and they attack with purpose every time, that makes them deadly. A perfect example of this is the Joker. He doesn't actually have that many resources, he's not physically powerful really, but he attacks in such a calculated way that every time he does so much damage with so little weapons and so little actual physical power. The second tip to create an interesting, unique villain that is not just your run-of-the-mill kind of guy who's a villain, but he's the kind of villain who's just your top of the dog kind of villain, who is very deep and layered, is to give them a motivation that is beyond simply power and money. Create a villain whose motivation is to prove a point. For example, the Joker wants to prove that actually everybody is like him. President Snow in the Hunger Games actually believes that he is someone who restores balance and peace to the world with his peacemakers, even though it's a very destructive way of doing it. Create a villain who wants to restore balance to the world and actually believes that they're doing it in the right way, even though we can see that is very flawed. The classic example is in films that have overpopulation and they want to just cull the population, which is basically evil, but you kind of think about it, you're like, if they cull the population, that would solve the problem and no one would have to live in a flippin' horrible world with overpopulation and everyone is starving. But actually it's kind of evil because you're killing loads of people, like Thanos. He wanted to kill half of the population of the entire universe, and that's kind of seen as evil, you know, as evil. You know, you're killing people. This is just not right. But if you think about it, he's actually solving a problem and he believes in his cause, and that is what makes him so terrifying, because you actually relate to him and you actually agree with him on some level, but actually it's kind of wrong. It's kind of wrong. The third tip is to let them win. If you think about it, it is actually very exciting when the villain actually wins a lot of battles, because it increases the tension and it increases your mental devotion to the story, because you want to see what is going to happen, because it makes it more believable, because you are wondering, is actually it going to turn out right? You know, is it actually going to turn out okay? And this concept is used in pretty much most horror movies, because the villain or the spectre or the ghost almost always wins. For example, in The Woman in Black or Paranormal Activity, in those films the villain basically wins, and the whole film is a series of catastrophes for the protagonist. We basically read stories because we want bad stuff to happen in the stories. Imagine if you read a story that was just good all the way through. Frodo went to the Shire, he met with Gandalf, he had a big party, he opened some presents here, and then all the elves came and they joined in, and then Sauron reckoned, you know, why not just call it a day and just say, let's all live in the Shire and be happy? Probably you wouldn't read that story, right? The Joker Joker set up a situation in The Dark Knight where he couldn't lose, where he had to win. He told Batman that Harvey Dent was in one place and Rachel was in another place, and at a certain time they would both blow up, so Batman only had time to save one of them. So he set up a situation where he couldn't lose and one of them had to die. The fourth tip is to give them a detailed past. J.K. Rowling is a perfect example of an author who creates extremely detailed pasts for all of her characters so she knows them like actual people. And if you can do this with the villain, then that is even more powerful because you show the reason why they are what they are today, and the fact that their motives are very reasonable and they're backed up by things that happened in their past, that you can totally understand how they are who they are today. For example, the Joker was beaten up, abused by people who were much richer than him, and because of that he has a deep hate for people who are rich and deep hate for money, and he doesn't care about money, he just wants to see the world burn. Or Voldemort, who was conceived with a love potion, and because of that he can't feel love and he can't really empathize with people and he can't feel any kind of emotion because he's just conceived under a love potion, and that's why he can't. The fifth tip is to give them an army, or at least a group of henchmen, because if you think about every single villain, Voldemort, the Joker, Palpatine, Lord Ruler, Sauron, President Snow, Davy Jones, and even dictators like Hitler and Stalin all had a huge army at their command, and because of that they could create such high, intense conflict because they had so much power, basically. Conflict is perhaps the most important part of any story. That is why it is almost vital for a villain to have some kind of army, or at least a group of henchmen at their command. So here's a quick summary of the 5 points. The first one is to create a villain who has more power, and perhaps has power in a less traditional way than simply money or magical ability. The second tip is to create a character whose motivation is not to gain money or power, but to prove a point, a political point that they believe in strongly. The third tip is to let them win because it increases the conflict and it makes it even more believable. The fourth tip is to give them a detailed past that completely explains why they're so evil and creates a very plausible, rational reason why they are who they are. The fifth tip is to create an army to create even more conflict in the story. Cowboy Josh, what do you think is the best villain ever? Oh. Yeah. Me. I somehow knew that you'd say something like that. But what makes you think that you are the best villain?
Well, I went down to the valley this morning and I killed a man. Dead. He was dead as a rock. I shot him. He ain't getting back up. No one is once I shoot him.
Okay, just gonna end the video then. On that note, if you found this video interesting or useful, give it a like and comment what is your favourite villain, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.